They said I was no longer welcome in the house I once helped to build, the house where I scrubbed the floors until my knees cracked and cooked dinners until the smell of onions clung to the wallpaper. And it was my own son who said the words as if he were closing a window on a gust of air he could not stand. Quick, firm, with no hesitation, just a brutal finality. "You're not welcome here." That sentence, short and sharp as a blade, seemed to slice the very air between us, and I felt it lodge inside my chest, in the place where for 78 years I had carried the stubborn belief that family is sacred, that a son will never forget the hands that once carried him, the nights spent by his feverish bed, the lunches packed in a hurry when the alarm rang too late, the rent paid when his first job paid too little, the sacrifices made in silence because love, at least in my understanding, required no announcement. I am 78. I live alone now in a modest apartment with paint peeling from the windowsills and a kettle that whistles more angrily than gently. But once, not so long ago, I thought I had a home in my son's life. I thought I was still his mother in more than just name. I thought I had earned my place at his table by the decades of devotion no one else witnessed and no one else can tally. Yet that night, standing in the narrow hallway of his immaculate suburban house, with my shoes still damp from the rain and my hands clutching a small plastic bag with the apple pie I had baked for his daughter, my granddaughter, who loves cinnamon more than anything in the world, I understood that love had been rewritten into a kind of contract I had never signed, and now he was tearing it in front of me, without guilt, without tremor. I remember the details because that is what happens when pain is fresh. The polished floor that reflected the overhead light so brightly I could see my shoes distorted on its surface, the faint smell of expensive detergent rising from the carpeted stairs, the way the dog, their golden retriever, padded silently behind his wife as she crossed the living room and gave me a smile so thin it could have been a paper cut. She did not speak. She did not have to, because her silence was the frame into which his words fit perfectly. The words sounded rehearsed, not improvised, as if they had been uttered many times behind closed doors before being brought out like a rehearsed line in a cruel performance. My son, my only child, stood there with his jaw tight and his eyes avoiding mine, and though his lips said, "You are not welcome," what I heard underneath was, "You are no longer necessary, no longer convenient, no longer the person we wish to display to the world." And the echo of that hit me harder than anything else, harder than his words, harder than the silence of his wife, harder than the sight of the pie still untouched in my hands. I was being erased while still alive, dismissed like an old piece of furniture too bulky to fit the new decor. I did not argue. I did not plead. I did not collapse into tears as he might have expected. I stood still, every muscle in my back tense with the effort of dignity, and nodded as if he had told me the weather forecast or reminded me to take an umbrella. My knees hurt. They always do after walking in the cold rain. But at that moment, I refused to show weakness, because weakness would have been an invitation for pity, and pity from your own son is a humiliation, worse than rejection. So I turned. I walked down his perfect little path lined with trimmed hedges, and I felt the drizzle settle on my hair, soaking through my old wool coat, and I kept walking. Not because I was strong, but because I was too shocked to stop. The street was empty, the lamps glowing in circles of gold that seemed to mock me with their stillness, and my bag felt heavy, though it contained only the pie. I made it to the bus stop, sat on the wet bench, And for the first time in years, I did not check my phone, did not wonder if someone would call to ask if I was safe, because I already knew no one would. Now, in my little apartment, months later, I still hear that sentence when I pour my morning coffee, when I sweep the floor, when I glance at the framed photograph of him as a boy that I keep on my dresser, though I sometimes think I should hide it away. It repeats in my head like an uninvited hymn. You're not welcome here. You're not welcome here. You're not welcome here. And every time I hear it, I remind myself that it was not whispered by a stranger on the street, not muttered by some bureaucrat in an office, but spoken by the boy I once held so tightly against my chest that I could feel the fragile flutter of his newborn ribs under my palm. That is the hook of my story, the wound at its center. The unbearable truth that the child you gave everything to can one day look at you as if you are an intruder, a trespasser, an inconvenience. And when I tell you this now, I tell it not for sympathy, but because silence only serves those who inflict the wound. I speak because I want it known. Betrayal does not always come from enemies. It comes from the faces we once kissed good night. The defining act that turned humiliation into something undeniable happened not in an explosion of anger, but in the ordinary cruelty of omission, the kind that looks, from a distance, like nothing at all, but from the inside feels like the ground giving way beneath your feet. I had gone to my son's house that evening because he had told me, with a tone that carried both duty and reluctance, that I could bring over a pie for the children. He had not invited me for dinner, not exactly, but he had not forbidden me either, and for me that was enough of an opening to believe, even briefly, that I still had a place in his life. I had risen early that morning to peel the apples, my hands aching as the knife slipped along the fruit, and I had added cinnamon and sugar the way my granddaughter likes, humming to myself in the kitchen like a woman rehearsing love in flour and butter. By the time the pie came out of the oven, golden and fragrant, I felt, foolishly perhaps, that I had made something not just to eat, but to be remembered by, a gesture so small yet so deeply rooted in the language of care that I thought it might soften whatever hardness had settled in my son's chest. But when I arrived, carrying the pie carefully in a bag to protect it from the drizzle, the air inside the house was already thick with tension, though no one spoke of it. His wife barely looked up from the baby in her arms, murmuring something about how sugar was not really good for children, and my son shifted uncomfortably as if even my presence had tilted the balance of his carefully orchestrated evening. I tried to speak lightly, to say that a slice of pie never harmed anyone, that childhood deserves its moments of sweetness. But my words fell flat, absorbed by the silence that hovered between the three of us. And then, without warning, as I bent to take off my shoes and set the pie on the counter, he turned to me and spoke the words that stripped away decades in an instant. "You're not welcome here." He did not shout. He did not tremble. His voice was calm, measured, as if this was a line in a script he had rehearsed many times until it carried no trace of hesitation. His wife exhaled quietly, not in shock, but in relief, and I understood with a clarity that nearly knocked me off balance that this was not a slip of the tongue. It was a verdict, and it had been decided long before I arrived with my pie. The betrayal was not just in the words, but in the history that they erased. For years I had been the one to answer the phone when his world fell apart, the one to step in when his debts piled higher than his salary, the one to care for his children when he and his wife needed a weekend away, the one to celebrate birthdays with cakes made from scratch, even when my joints screamed from hours of stirring and kneading. I had thought, perhaps naively, that these acts created a bond that could not be broken, that gratitude would knit itself into love, that loyalty would flow naturally from years of sacrifice. But in that moment, I saw that gratitude had been fleeting, loyalty conditional, and love replaced by convenience. My usefulness had expired, and with it, my welcome. I remember clutching the edge of the counter to steady myself, not because I was going to faint, but because the room suddenly seemed tilted, unfamiliar, as if I had walked into a stranger's house rather than the home of my child. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. What could I say that would not sound like begging? What explanation could I offer that would not turn me into a supplicant at the door of a life I had once built from nothing? He looked at me then, not with anger, but with something worse: indifference. And I realized that my presence was not just unwelcome, it was irrelevant. The pie on the counter, the years behind me, the love I still carried, it all meant nothing in the cold arithmetic of his new life. When I finally turned and walked out, the drizzle had turned into steady rain, and the street seemed deserted, as if the whole neighborhood had chosen that night to close its doors and hide behind curtains. I walked slowly, each step heavy, each drop of rain clinging to my coat like a reminder of where I stood in the world now. Outside, excluded, dismissed. I did not cry, though the pressure behind my eyes was sharp, because crying felt too small for the enormity of what had just been done. This was not a quarrel that could be mended with an apology, not a misunderstanding that could be cleared with a phone call. This was the severing of something I had thought unbreakable, the silent agreement between mother and son that whatever else might falter, their bond would endure. At home, when I unlocked my own door and stepped into the dim apartment, the betrayal replayed itself with cruel precision. I saw his face, calm and resolved, his wife's relieved silence, the untouched pie. I sat at the table and placed the pie in front of me, its golden crust now soggy from the condensation of the bag, and I could not bring myself to cut a slice. It sat there like an artifact from another world, a relic of love that no longer had a recipient. I stared at it until the room grew darker, and the only sound was the steady tick of the old wall clock, and I thought, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that my son had not simply hurt me. He had removed me. He had taken the invisible role I had occupied in his life and erased it with a single sentence. And that, I think, is the true face of betrayal. Not anger, not shouting, not the heated exchange of harsh words, but the quiet dismissal that tells you your existence no longer matters in the places you once belonged. It is betrayal wrapped in civility, cruelty masked as composure, rejection delivered without raising a voice. It is the moment when you realize that your years of love are not a shield, but a fragile memory that can be discarded at will. That night, as I sat alone with the pie untouched, I understood that something irreversible had happened, and no matter how many mornings I might wake to the sound of the kettle, no matter how many times I might try to reframe the moment as a misunderstanding, the truth would remain. My son had looked at me, the woman who had given him life, and told me I was not welcome. The night after I was told I was not welcome, I moved through my apartment like a woman inhabiting the wrong body, each movement heavy and deliberate, as though my limbs were made of stone and my chest carried an invisible weight that bent me forward. I had thought, as I walked back in the rain, that the hardest part would be surviving the words themselves, the sharpness of that rejection. But I was wrong. The harder part was the silence that followed, the long hours where the words kept echoing inside me with no one to interrupt them, no voice to soften them, no gentle presence to contradict them. My small apartment, usually a place of predictable routines and modest comfort, suddenly felt cavernous with absence, every shadow too sharp, every sound too loud, every corner filled with the memory of what had just happened. I sat at the kitchen table, the pie untouched, the light bulb flickering overhead, and I realized that I was now both judge and witness to a trial I had never asked for. Morning came without the relief of sleep. I had dozed in the chair, my neck stiff, my body slumped forward like a marionette whose strings had been cut. When the light pushed through the thin curtains, pale and unforgiving, I moved slowly to the stove and put the kettle on. The whistle, when it came, sounded shrill, almost mocking, and I poured the hot water over a tea bag and sat down again at the table. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the cup, not from age or weakness, but from the realization that everything in my life had tilted overnight. I had always known my son could be impatient, that his wife had no great warmth for me, but I had never believed they would cross the threshold into banishment. Yet here I was, sipping tea in a kitchen where the only voices were the ones in my head, replaying the moment again and again until it no longer felt like a memory, but like a sentence etched into the walls. I decided, as the tea cooled, that I would not call him. Pride held me back, yes, but it was not only pride. It was also the deep, tired knowledge that if I called, if I begged, if I asked for clarification, I would be placing my dignity into his hands, and he had already shown me he would drop it without hesitation. So I remained silent. I folded my silence around me like a blanket, even though it was rough and suffocating, because it was the only protection I had left. That day passed slowly. I moved between the rooms like a ghost, pausing at the window to watch the children of the building across the street chase each other to school, their laughter bright and careless. And I thought of my granddaughter, the one I had baked the pie for, and wondered if she had asked where I was, if she had noticed my absence. I doubted anyone explained. The days that followed carried the quiet worsening of my exile. There were no phone calls, no texts, no sudden knock on the door. My son did not appear to take back his words, and his wife did not offer any softened message of reconciliation. The silence itself became an accomplice to the betrayal, confirming over and over again that what I had been told was not a temporary cruelty, but a decision, a line drawn in permanent ink. I found myself walking less and less into the world. Trips to the grocery store felt like performances, each smile forced, each step measured. I worried that the neighbors could see the fracture inside me, that the cashier would notice the way I hesitated over every purchase, as though bread or milk could anchor me back into the world. I took to shopping at odd hours, slipping into the aisles when the store was nearly empty, hiding from eyes that might read the truth on my face. Inside my apartment, the air grew heavier with each day. The television played in the background, but I barely noticed the words, the flickering light only reminding me of how quickly time passed when there was nothing to fill it. I opened old photo albums, tracing my fingers over images of my son as a boy, his grin wide, his eyes bright, and I felt the strangest sensation, as though the boy in the photographs and the man who told me I was unwelcome were two different people entirely, and I had been left with the crueler of the two. I whispered aloud sometimes, speaking to the boy, not the man, telling him that I had loved him, that I had never wanted this, that I wished he could remember the nights I held him through storms, the mornings I walked him to school even when my back ached, the sacrifices I made in silence because I thought love was louder in actions than in words. The pie remained untouched for days, sitting first on the counter, then eventually pushed into the corner, as though hiding it could erase the memory of why it was baked. I could not bring myself to eat it, could not bring myself to throw it away. It became a silent witness, a symbol of all the love I had offered that no longer had a home. Each time I passed it, I felt the sting of rejection anew, as if the crust itself whispered that my efforts were futile. On the third day, I finally wrapped it tightly and placed it in the freezer, not because I thought I would eat it later, but because I could not stand to see it rot. It seemed wrong that something made with such care should crumble into waste, even if it had been denied. The isolation began to sink into my bones. The phone that once buzzed with small requests, "Can you babysit? Can you pick up milk? Can you come early to help?" sat silent on the table, a slab of plastic and glass that no longer connected me to anyone. I found myself glancing at it every few minutes, hoping for the glow of a message, the sound of a call, but each time it remained dark, and the absence became its own kind of noise, loud in its emptiness. I tried to distract myself with books, with the crossword puzzles I once enjoyed, but the words blurred, and the clues seemed meaningless. My mind circled back always to the same place, the same sentence, the same moment in the polished hallway, where everything had shifted. Nights were the worst. I would lie in bed, the darkness pressing close, and imagine the life unfolding in my son's house without me. I pictured the table set for dinner, the laughter of the children, the clink of glasses, and I imagined my chair missing, my presence unacknowledged, as if I had never existed at all. It was not the absence of food or company that hurt. It was the deliberate erasure, the sense that my son's life could be curated to look whole while removing the very person who had given him life. That thought carved into me like ice. I would turn on the lamp, stare at the ceiling, and remind myself to breathe. Because even breath seemed borrowed now, as though I had to justify it to a world that had deemed me unnecessary. As the week wore on, I noticed how quickly invisibility becomes habit. No one asked where I was. No one noticed I had not visited. I could have vanished entirely, and the world outside my apartment would not have shifted. I walked to the mailbox one morning, the cold air biting at my face, and saw neighbors chatting on the steps of another building. They did not look at me. They did not wave. I realized then that exile is not just a private wound. It becomes a cloak that others can see, an aura that tells them to keep their distance. I carried that cloak back inside with me, hung it on the hook with my coat, and knew that it would not be easily removed. The quiet worsening of my situation was not dramatic, not filled with shouting or broken dishes. It was slower, more insidious, a steady dimming of the light inside me, a gradual erosion of my sense of belonging. Each day without contact from my son or his family confirmed the permanence of the rejection. Each hour alone in my apartment deepened the silence until it became part of my very skin. I had thought the betrayal itself was the wound, but now I saw that the real injury was the void that followed, the way absence spread like a shadow. filling every corner, every breath, until I could no longer remember what it felt like to be wanted. The shift did not come like thunder, not in a burst of clarity or a sudden blaze of courage, but in something quieter, almost invisible, the way a plant leans toward the light without anyone noticing until one day it is turned completely. It was a Tuesday morning when I felt it first, a day like any other. Gray sky pressing low against the buildings, the radiator clicking and groaning as though tired of its own work, and I rose from the bed with the same heaviness I had carried for days. I shuffled into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and waited for the whistle. And for the first time since that night, I realized that the silence in my apartment was not unbearable, but pliable. Something I could mold rather than something crushing me into dust. I poured the tea and sat at the table, and instead of staring at the phone, I looked at the window. The glass was streaked from the rain, and beyond it a sparrow hopped along the railing of the fire escape, pecking at something invisible. It was such a small thing, but it caught my attention, and I found myself leaning closer, following its movements, feeling for the first time in weeks a faint spark of curiosity that was mine alone and not dependent on anyone's recognition. That morning, instead of staying indoors, I put on my coat and stepped outside. My knees complained, as they always do, but the air felt different, sharper, more honest than the stale breath of my apartment. I walked slowly around the block, one step at a time, letting the rhythm of my own body remind me that I still existed in motion, not just in memory. The neighborhood was indifferent to me, strangers hurrying past, buses groaning at the corners, children tugging on their parents' hands, but that indifference carried a strange kind of freedom. They did not see me as unwelcome or erased. They did not see me at all, and though once that thought would have deepened the ache, in that moment it offered relief. To be unseen by strangers was not the same as being dismissed by your own blood. It was lighter, easier, less cruel. I stopped at a small bakery I had passed countless times before, but never entered. The smell of bread wafted through the open door, warm and yeasty, and I found myself stepping inside without planning it. The counter was cluttered with baskets of rolls, loaves with cracked crusts, pastries dusted with sugar, and behind it, a young woman smiled at me with the kind of politeness that expects nothing in return. "Good morning," she said, and though it was an ordinary greeting, I felt it settle into me like a balm. I bought a single roll, still warm, and when I bit into it outside, the steam hit my tongue, and I closed my eyes for a moment. It was just bread, nothing miraculous, but it tasted like permission, like proof that I could still choose small joys for myself. When I returned home, I placed the half-eaten roll on a plate and sat by the window, staring at it as though it were a revelation. That was when I understood the shift. I had been waiting, suspended in the hope that my son would call, that his words could be undone, that the story could be rewritten. But waiting had trapped me in his silence, made me a prisoner of his choices. If I kept waiting, I would rot like the pie I could not bring myself to eat. The only way forward was to stop waiting and begin moving, even if the steps were small, even if the destination was unclear. That realization frightened me and comforted me in equal measure. I was old, yes, but not so old that my life was already finished, not so frail that I had to accept invisibility as my final chapter. I had been through worse storms, the death of my husband, the long years of work that bent my spine and hardened my hands, the loneliness that sometimes pressed so close I thought it might suffocate me. And I had endured. Why then should I collapse now, at the words of a son who had chosen comfort over truth? I told myself, gently but firmly, that I had to reclaim even the smallest corner of dignity, the smallest slice of independence, and that I would begin with myself. That afternoon, I took out an old notebook I had kept in a drawer, one with a faded blue cover and lined pages yellowed at the edges, and I began to write. Not letters to him, not explanations or pleas, but words for myself. I wrote, "I am still here. I am still mine." The handwriting wavered, my fingers stiff from age, but the act itself felt powerful, as though I were planting a flag in the barren soil of my life. I wrote more, small fragments, memories of my childhood, lines of songs my mother used to hum, the recipe for the soup I had once made for my husband when he came home exhausted from work. It was not polished, not beautiful, but it was mine, and filling the pages gave me a sense of presence I had not felt in weeks. The days that followed began to change, slowly, like a tide pulling back. I still felt the wound, the rawness of rejection, but I also felt the stirring of something else, a quiet resistance. I walked more often, sometimes to the park where the benches were hard and cold, but the air was full of voices that did not belong to me, and that was enough. I bought small things for myself, a new bar of soap with lavender scent, a second-hand scarf from a thrift store, little tokens that reminded me I could care for myself without anyone's permission. And each time I did, the shadow of his words seemed to shrink, not disappear, but retreat enough to let the light in. I did not turn on my phone for days, and that too became a kind of shift. At first I checked it constantly, hoping for a call. Then I began to ignore it, and finally I left it in a drawer, the silence of it no longer cutting, but strangely peaceful. It was not punishment. It was protection. I needed to step out of the rhythm of his absence and find the rhythm of my own presence. In the evenings, I brewed tea and sat by the window with my notebook, writing down one thing each day that belonged only to me. One day, it was the sound of a violin drifting from a neighbor's apartment. Another day, it was the taste of honey melting into my tea. Another day, it was simply the fact that I had risen, dressed, and walked into the world. The shift, I realized, was not about forgiving or forgetting. It was about choosing not to vanish. My son had told me I was not welcome in his house, but he had not stripped me of my right to welcome myself into my own life. That right remained, stubborn and intact, and I intended to claim it. I was not yet certain how, not yet brave enough to declare it aloud, but I could feel the beginnings of a new kind of strength coiling inside me, quiet but steady, waiting to unfold. And for the first time since the night of betrayal, I allowed myself to believe that my story was not over, that there was still a chapter to be written with my own hand, in my own words, on pages no one else could tear from me. The weeks that followed my quiet decision to stop waiting carried a strange rhythm, almost like a borrowed song, something not fully mine yet, but recognizable enough to hum along with. I kept my notebook close, writing each day not because the words came easily, but because I needed to anchor myself, to leave small traces of my presence where none seemed to remain. Walking became a habit, the air filling my lungs with reminders that the world moved on regardless of who had chosen to exclude me. I bought small groceries, baked bread once for myself alone, and even allowed myself to laugh softly at a television program that once felt too empty to fill the silence. For a while, I believed perhaps the worst had passed, that my son's words, though still sharp in memory, could be filed away like an old injury, always sore when pressed, but no longer capable of paralyzing me. And then the past returned, not loudly, not violently, but in ways so insidious and persistent that my newfound stability trembled at its edges, tested with each intrusion. It began with the phone. I had left it untouched for so long that when I finally opened the drawer and turned it on, the vibrations startled me like the sudden buzzing of a trapped insect. The screen lit up with missed calls, messages stacked one after another, some from numbers I recognized, others anonymous, all carrying the weight of a world I had tried to shut out. My son's name appeared first, message after message, his words terse at the beginning. "Where are you? This isn't funny." Then increasingly impatient, then finally distant, as though even in writing he was withdrawing, leaving behind only the faint scent of obligation. There was one from his wife, carefully phrased, a performance of concern that dripped with a falseness I could feel even through the screen. "We're worried. Please let us know you're okay." And then there was one more, and this one made me sit down, my legs suddenly weak beneath me. It was from my grandson, the boy who once painted birdhouses with me in the yard and declared them the best in the world. His message was simple, written with none of the polished restraint of adults. "Grandma, where did you go? I miss you." That single line broke through every defense I had built, not because it demanded anything of me, but because it reminded me that I was not invisible to everyone. Not yet. I did not answer. Not immediately. My hands hovered over the keys, trembling with the weight of all the things I wanted to say and all the things I could not bring myself to voice. I placed the phone back in the drawer, as though closing it could protect me. But his words lingered in my chest, a warmth that hurt more than the cold rejection of his father. For days afterward, I walked with those words in my pocket, as if carrying them with me could soften the edges of my solitude. Yet with them came a renewed pressure, the sense that the silence I had chosen was no longer entirely mine, that I was being pulled back into the web of expectations and manipulations I had fled. The second intrusion was a letter. It arrived one afternoon in a plain envelope with no return address, the handwriting unfamiliar but deliberate. I opened it with the small thrill of curiosity, half expecting it to be some misplaced bill, but inside was a photocopy of a newspaper article. My breath caught as I saw my own face printed there, an old photograph taken years ago at some family gathering, me holding a dish and smiling faintly, the kind of smile you give when you are already tired, but do not want to ruin the moment. The headline above it screamed louder than I had been able to in weeks: "Community Family Appeals for Missing Grandmother." I read the article with a mix of disbelief and bitter amusement. There was my son's name, quoted as saying they were deeply worried, that I had vanished suddenly, that they only wanted to know I was safe. His wife, too, speaking of vulnerability, of fear that something terrible had happened to me, as though they were the caretakers of my well-being, as though I had not been pushed out deliberately from the safety of their home. I laughed then, not out of joy, but out of something sharper, a jagged sound that startled even me. Vulnerable, they called me, as though my silence was a collapse, not a choice, as though my absence was an accident, not a declaration. The article spread in ways I could not contain. At the bakery where I had begun to buy my rolls, The cashier gave me a second glance, her smile tinged with something like pity. A neighbor mentioned casually that she had seen my picture in the paper, asked if I was all right, her tone hovering between kindness and gossip. Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of being seen again, but seen wrongly, cast into the role of a fragile, lost woman, rather than the truth of what I was, a woman who had finally taken a step away from humiliation. That visibility was its own kind of prison. I longed again for the invisibility I had been learning to inhabit, the kind that allowed me to shape my own days without explanation. The final test came when my son himself appeared, unannounced, on my doorstep. It was early morning, the kettle just beginning to hiss, when the knock rattled the door with an urgency that made my heart race. I knew before I opened it who it would be. The stance, the outline visible through the frosted glass, was unmistakable. I hesitated, my hand on the knob, every instinct torn between the years of maternal reflex that wanted to rush toward him and the hard-earned clarity that warned me to guard my space. When I did open the door, he stood there, not polished as he usually was, not with his tie knotted and his voice rehearsed, but disheveled, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep, his jaw unshaven, his words stumbling. "Mom," he said, "please, can we talk?" He held no flowers, no gifts, only his own weariness, and for a moment I felt the sharp tug of recognition, the memory of the boy he once was, the boy who had once clung to my hand in the dark. But then I remembered the sentence, the polished cruelty of it, the calm dismissal that had rewritten everything, and the softness drained away. He began to speak quickly, his words tumbling over themselves. He said it was a mistake, that he had been angry, pressured, that his wife had pushed him, that he had not meant the finality of it. He said he needed me, that the children needed me, that he could not sleep knowing I was out here alone. He begged, yes, begged, a word I never thought I would use for my son. His voice cracking as he pleaded for me to open the door wider, to let him in, to return to the role I had always played. And for a flicker of a moment, I almost yielded. The sight of him standing there, vulnerable, desperate, stripped of the armor he usually wore, it pulled at something deep and instinctive in me. But then the clarity rose again, firm and unyielding. I saw not a man seeking reconciliation, but a man seeking comfort, a man looking for me, not because he had rediscovered my worth, but because he needed the cushion of my presence to soften his own turmoil. I kept my hand on the door, my body blocking the entry, and I listened. I let him pour out his apologies, his explanations, his desperate revisions of the truth, and when he finally fell silent, looking at me with eyes that begged for rescue, I said nothing. I simply closed the door, slowly, deliberately, until the latch clicked into place. My heart pounded, my knees trembled, but I did not waver. On the other side of the door I heard his breath, ragged, his footsteps shifting, a muttered curse, and then silence as he walked away. I leaned against the door, my palms flat against the wood, and let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, not because I lacked love for him, but because I finally understood that love without respect is a chain, and I had been chained long enough. That moment marked the true escalation, the point where my resolve was tested and held. The phone would ring again, the letters might come, the articles might continue to paint me as fragile, but I had tasted the act of refusing, and it filled me with a strength that no apology could erase. The world outside might still misunderstand, might still pity, might still pressure me back into the role of the compliant mother. But inside my small apartment, with the kettle cooling on the stove and the silence settling once more, I knew that I had crossed into a new territory. I was no longer waiting, no longer begging, no longer even explaining. I was standing, for the first time in decades, on my own ground. The day after I closed the door on my son, I felt a silence in the apartment, unlike the others I had endured. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of abandonment, but a charged stillness, alive with the weight of what I had done. I had not begged, had not bargained, had not allowed him to step back inside with his apologies that carried more need than remorse. I had turned him away, and in that act I realized something irreversible had happened. I had chosen myself over him, my dignity over his turmoil, my life over the comfort of returning to a role that had long ago exhausted me. The power of that choice shook me, not because it was easy, but because it was final. Once you close the door in that way, once you refuse to resume the cycle, there is no return to the old order. Something has broken, or perhaps something has mended, but in either case, it cannot be undone. I spent that morning pacing the rooms of my apartment, touching objects as if they were new, as if the very walls had absorbed the echo of my decision. The chair by the window where I had so often sat, waiting for a call, now looked different. Not a place of vigil, but a seat of observation. A space where I could look out at the world without longing to be summoned. The notebook on the table carried more weight now, not just a record of small resistances, but a testament to survival. Even the old teapot, chipped at the handle, seemed transformed, no longer a vessel for the endless cups of tea I drank while replaying his words, but a companion in this strange new chapter. My world had not changed outwardly, but I had, and that shift was monumental. By midday, the momentum of what I had done demanded something more tangible, something that could not be denied or dismissed. It was not enough to close the door. I had to write the line myself, to inscribe the boundary in a way that even he could not twist into performance. So I sat at my table with a pen, a stack of paper, and a steadiness I had not felt in years. I began to write a letter, not to plead, not to explain, but to state the truth plainly and without apology. My hand moved slowly, deliberately, each word heavy with finality. I am of sound mind. I am safe. I am not under anyone's control. I do not wish to return to your home, and I do not require your oversight. Any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern will be regarded as harassment. I signed my full name at the bottom, the name he had once scribbled on childish birthday cards, the name I had once placed on deeds and documents to save him from ruin, the name that was mine before I was ever his mother. Seeing it there, beneath those sentences, filled me with a pride that was neither loud nor giddy, but deep and anchoring, like a root burrowing into the ground. I folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it in an envelope addressed not to him directly, but to the lawyer he had sent after me, the man who had tried to couch control in the language of concern. This was my reply, my answer not shouted in hallways, but written calmly at a kitchen table, an act of resistance carried out in ink. When I dropped it into the postbox later that afternoon, my hands did not shake. I watched it disappear into the slot with a strange serenity, knowing that whatever storm might follow, this line had been drawn, and no one could erase it. That night, I took another step. I found a second sheet of paper and wrote a shorter letter, This one to his wife, the woman who had smiled so thinly when I first arrived with the pie, the woman who had stood silently while my son told me I was unwelcome. My letter to her was only 3 lines, but each one carried a weight honed by years of silence. I know what you did. I know what you did not say. I am not angry. I am not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I have begun mine. I did not sign it with warmth, only with my name, clear and steady, not as mother-in-law, not as grandmother, but as myself. Folding it, sealing it, and laying it beside the other envelope, I felt something close in me, a door locking not from the outside but from within, sealing me away from a cycle I would no longer participate in. As the days passed, I expected the gnaw of regret, the late-night doubt, the instinct to reach for the phone. But instead, I felt lighter. Not happy exactly. Not yet. But unburdened. For decades, I had moved through life carrying the weight of being needed, believing that my worth was tied to the services I could provide, the meals cooked, the children minded, the bills covered in silence. When that need turned into dismissal, I had thought it meant my life was over, that without their reliance, I was nothing. But now, after drawing my own line, I saw the truth. My worth had never been theirs to measure, never theirs to grant or revoke. It had always been mine, and in reclaiming it, I had done something irreversible. One evening, as the sun slipped low and painted the walls of my apartment in a soft amber glow, I took my old navy coat from its hook by the door. It was frayed at the edges, worn thin in the sleeves, but I buttoned it carefully and stood in front of the mirror. I looked at myself, my lined face, my tired eyes, the slight stoop of my shoulders, and for the first time in years I did not see a burden or an afterthought. I saw a woman who had closed a door on humiliation, who had written her own refusal, who had stepped, however shakily, into freedom. I whispered aloud, softly, so that only I could hear it. You are still here. You are still yours. That whisper, small and almost tender, was my climax. It was not dramatic, not loud, not something the world would mark in headlines or neighbors would gossip about. But it was the turning point that mattered most, the moment where the story shifted permanently, where I became not the mother begging for recognition, but the woman who had chosen herself. From here, there would be no return to the silence of waiting, no collapse into the role of the convenient grandmother, no submission to the rewriting of truth. Whatever came next, it would be mine, written by my own hand, lived in my own name. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice a quiet steadiness in myself, a calm that did not erase the pain of what had been done, but softened it enough that I could carry it without breaking. Each morning, I rose not with the dread of waiting for a phone that would never ring, but with the simple knowledge that the day was mine to shape, even in small ways. I walked to the park when the sun allowed, sat on benches and watched strangers pass, listened to the shuffle of leaves underfoot, and realized that life continued whether or not I was invited to sit at my son's table. For the first time in years, I stopped measuring my existence by what role I filled in someone else's household. Instead, I measured it in tea brewed just the way I liked it, in pages of my notebook slowly filling with words, in the quiet satisfaction of hanging laundry by the window and watching it sway in the light breeze. These were not grand victories, but they were mine, and in them I found a kind of peace I had long denied myself. Sometimes his face still came to me at night, the echo of his words, the look in his eyes when he stood on my doorstep, begging me to let him back in. For a long time I had feared that memory would undo me, that it would drag me back into doubt or longing. But instead, it grew fainter, like a photograph left in the sun. What remained was not the wound, but the lesson. That love which demands silence and self-erasure is no love at all. That respect cannot be begged for. That a bond severed by cruelty cannot be mended by convenience. I did not hate him, and I did not wish him harm. But I no longer believed I owed him more than I owed myself. That clarity was not bitter. It was freeing. One evening, I brewed a pot of tea and set it by the window, lighting the old lamp with its faded shade. The apartment glowed softly, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to fill the silence with noise. I let it rest around me like a blanket, not heavy now, but comforting, proof that I could live within my own company and not be diminished by it. I picked up my notebook and wrote one final line across the page, steady and certain. I will not vanish. Seeing the words there gave me a sense of closure, not because the story had been tied neatly, but because it no longer needed to consume me. It could rest, and so could I. And so I leave this account not as a plea for understanding, but as a mark of survival. If another woman, somewhere, finds herself dismissed, told she is unwelcome in the very place she once poured her life into, let her know that it is possible to walk away with dignity intact. The world may call you fragile, the family may paint you as confused or lost, but only you know the truth of your strength. Only you can choose to close the door and write your own ending. I have done so, and though I am old and though the years ahead may be few, they are mine, and that is enough.